In this video, I'm going to discuss my trip to Kentucky for the 2024 annual Bourbon Festival. The cost of general admission for all 3 days was $180 per person, and then there is the cost of travel and hotels to consider. So that begs the question of whether it was worth it. The short answer is that I believe it was worth it for me, though I am not eager to repeat the experience next year. If your goal is to get a lot of rare and allocated bottles of bourbon for at or close to MSRP, and you also don't mind waking up early to stand or sit in line, then you will probably arrive at a similar conclusion. Also, if you just want to try a lot of samples of various whiskeys from Kentucky distilleries and you don't mind waiting in line for those, then it may also be worth it. With that, we can go through my trip day by day, and I'll explain what bottles were obtained and my general experience. My first full day in Kentucky was on Thursday, the 12th of September. This was the day before the Bourbon Festival started, so my brother and I traveled to various distilleries to see if they were stocking anything special leading up to the big event. We started at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, which was conspicuously lacking in a high number of visitors. It made sense once they announced the allocated bottle for that day though, as it was just Weller's Special Reserve. Still, the Buffalo Trace Distillery is an enjoyable place to visit if you've never been there, and you can enjoy your time just by looking around. Next up, we got into my car, which I drove to Kentucky in, and made our way west towards Bardstown. Along the way, we stopped at the Wild Turkey Distillery. They had a few bottles of Master's Keep Voyage available, but I personally didn't like the value proposition of that release. Instead, we got 2 bottles of Wild Turkey's 70th anniversary release, which is an 8-year age-dated Wild Turkey 101. It's not exactly a crazy value purchase at $55 plus tax, but I think it was worth getting at least one of these bottles if you see it at retail. After that, we headed further west to the James Beam Distillery, and they were absolutely loaded in preparation for the festival. They had Knob Creek 18-year, 12-year, and 10-year rye, Baker's 13, and even a Hardin's Creek release, all for a little over MSRP. In addition, customers were only limited to one of each type of release that was available, so if you wanted to splurge and get one of everything, you could. I've seen Knob Creek 18 a few times at that price point, so we passed on it. Instead, we got 1 bottle of the 2 other special releases that were on the shelf. Our final stop for the day was at Costco, and we were there mainly to get supplies for the road trip. However, we stopped in at the liquor sales section to find a ton of great deals on plenty of shelfers, and even a few higher-end bottles, like a Knob Creek barrel pick that was just over 10 years aged, and a fancy new-looking Angel's Envy single barrel at 116 proof, which we passed on. The main score there was 2 bottles of Russell's Reserve 15-year for $20 below MSRP. Looking back, this was probably the best day of the entire trip, because we managed to get a lot of nice allocated bottles at around MSRP with minimal time spent waiting in line, although we did have to do a lot of driving. For day 2, Friday, we got up at around 3 a.m. and made a somewhat precarious drive down to Maker's Mark Distillery for their 2024 Cellar Aged Bourbon release. It turns out the early arrival was unnecessary, as they still had bottles available for people showing up at around 9 a.m. when the doors opened. We got 2 bottles of the Cellar Aged Bourbon for an MSRP of $175. We also met a derpy-looking cat named Whiskey Jean and got to walk through the distillery grounds, which were very pretty and peaceful. At that point, it was around 10 a.m. and we decided to go to Buffalo Trace Distillery for a couple of bottles of E.H. Taylor's small batch. Little did we know that the gift shop was absolutely packed, and doing this prevented us from making it to the Bourbon Festival before the gates opened at 12 p.m. We were also very tired from the early rise and wanted to get to bed early so that we could make it to Four Roses for their 2024 limited edition release the next day. In hindsight, if I could have gone back and done things differently, I would have gone directly from the Maker's Mark Distillery to the Bourbon Festival for its opening day, as they apparently had an entire pallet of Old Fitzgerald very special 13-year at the Heaven Hill tent. Now, before moving on to the next day, I'll just say that when I first arrived in Kentucky on Wednesday, I stopped at the Four Roses Distillery, which was just a few miles from my hotel in Lawrenceburg. It's a very beautiful distillery on an average day and usually is not super busy. However, it was absolute pandemonium on the morning of the limited edition release, which was Saturday. Gates to the parking lot opened early at 3 a.m., and we showed up in our car at around 2:45. By that time, There were so many cars on the tiny road leading up to the distillery that we were a half a mile away from the entrance, and there were many more cars showing up after that behind us. Somehow, they were able to accommodate all the cars in front of ours, our own, and around 100 more behind us. The wait was made a little bit easier in that they opened up doors to sell bottles very early at around 7 a.m. However, waking up so early and waiting around for 4 hours definitely wasn't what I would call fun. It was fun though to get 2 bottles of the 2024 limited edition release from Four Roses for the MSRP price of around $225 though. This time around, we did make our way over to the Bourbon Festival grounds as soon as possible, showing up at around 9 a.m. to wait for gates to open at 12 p.m. We were pretty close to the front of the line there, but unfortunately, guests who paid nearly $600 for VIP access were let in at 11 a.m. to get first dibs on allocated releases. From what I heard, James Beam and Heaven Hill were the main attractions. James Beam had their new Little Book The Infinite and 2024 Booker's The Reserves special releases, in addition to Baker's 13 and a few other lesser releases. Heaven Hill, meanwhile, was selling their Heritage Collection 18-year bourbon and Parker's Heritage 14-year malt whiskey finished in cognac casks. The secondary prices on these bottles is absolutely staggering, and even MSRP is pushing the boundaries in my opinion. This was probably the worst line to wait in as you couldn't sit down and it was out in the hot sun. However, people were hopping in and out to get whiskey samples while we all waited for our chance to buy a bottle of some overpriced bourbon. On a sour note, the person directly in front of me decided that it was fair to leave the Heaven Hill line and go wait in the James Beam line to get a nice bottle over there. Then cut back into the Heaven Hill line where his friend was saving his spot. This sort of cheating behavior drew a lot of jeers and insults from everyone behind him, but he sort of just ignored us and there were no officials there to enforce the sanctity of the line, as it were. What was even more unfortunate is that he swooped up the last bottle of Parker's Heritage, literally the last person ahead of me. Gripes aside, my brother and I still walked out of the tent with 2 bottles of Heaven Hill's Heritage Collection 18-year bourbon. We could have stayed longer to sample whiskeys from the various distilleries' tents, but honestly it took so long to get samples and those samples were so small that achieving any sort of buzz was a hopeless endeavor. It was also pretty hot and we were both very tired, having woken up at 2 in the morning that day, so we decided to head back to the hotel for more bourbon and pizza. There was technically one more day of the festival left on Sunday, but I was personally sick and tired of waiting in line and was already over budget for the trip. My brother agreed on both counts, and so we left Kentucky a day early. From what I heard, Heaven Hill did have their newest release of Old Fitzgerald 10-year at the festival tent. That being said, they didn't have nearly as large of a supply, and hardly anyone in the general admission group was able to get a bottle. Now, here is where I got a little more personal value out of my own trip, as before driving back home, I drove down to Georgia to visit some family that had just moved there. On my way back from Georgia, I passed through Tennessee and stopped at Nashville Barrel Company, where I got to sample a bunch of their whiskey and purchased a 33-year-old hazmat Canadian whiskey after being able to sample it. I then made my way over to Hattie B's for an incredible Nashville hot chicken sandwich, bacon and cheddar grits, and banana pudding, before continuing on my journey home. I had to stop for a night in Missouri, and after a rainy morning, successfully completed my drive back to my home in Colorado. Here is a lineup of all the bottles I was able to pick up on my trip, and keep in mind that my brother took a few bottles back home with him. There are certain lessons from my experience that I want to sum up here. First of all, even if you don't buy any ticket to the Bourbon Festival, I still think that if you want to go to Kentucky and visit the distilleries, that you will get a lot more out of it if you plan to do it around the time of the festival, as distilleries definitely seem to release some of their most sought-after allocated bottles as part of the celebration. Also, it's not enough to just buy a general admission ticket to the festival and show up whenever. You have to be dedicated to waiting in line for multiple hours on each day to get decent value out of your ticket. Getting the cool bottles is fun, but waiting in line for them is not, at least in my opinion. Also keep in mind that if you fly out to the festival, you will have a hard limit on how many bottles you can purchase and bring back with you, whereas if you drive out, you can buy as many bottles as you can find and afford. To sum it up, the Kentucky Bourbon Festival embodies many of the best and worst qualities of the bourbon enthusiast culture. Also, the cost of the festival tickets, hotel stays, and travel fare is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how much money you'll be spending. Even though most of these bottles can be purchased at MSRP, they are still quite expensive, and it's totally debatable as to if they are worth the cost even at retail price. If someone asked me whether I was happy with everything I got out of the trip, I'd say absolutely. Now, if someone asked me whether I was eager to do this whole routine again next year, then my answer would be absolutely not. In fact, I've now got a backlog of bottles that I want to review on this channel, so I'll be giving my bank account a break while I do that. Also, I wouldn't describe my time in Kentucky as a relaxing vacation. It was more so an exhausting rat race to try and make the most of our limited time. In any case, if you want to see more honest bourbon reviews, you can find them over on my channel, and if you're new, consider subscribing. My cat Marshmallow and I greatly appreciate it. Have a great day, please drink responsibly, and as always, thanks for watching.